right, and I am taking off the practice session, so we're going to be live on Zoom as well.
Tell us when. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our virtual town hall with Congressman Scott Peters. I'm going to wait just about maybe 30 more seconds while people are logging in. Good afternoon, everyone. If you're just logging in or you're joining us on YouTube, my name is Mary Ann Pintar. I'm Congressman Scott Peters' Chief of Staff. I will be moderating our virtual town hall this afternoon. Today, we're going to be discussing two important and historic bills for the American people, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework and the Build Back Better Act. If you're having trouble logging onto the town hall via Zoom, you can stream the event live on Congressman Peters' YouTube page, which can be found by searching Congressman Scott Peters on YouTube. To begin today, Congressman Peters will provide about 10 minutes of remarks, and then we'll shift to taking your questions. If you'd like to ask a question and you're joining us via Zoom, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching on YouTube, you can post your question in the comments section and a member of our staff will send it to me. When you ask a question, when you drop it in the chat, I'm going to read your name and your question verbatim, and Congressman Peters will answer here live. We'll get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to prioritize people who ask questions who are from our district. And now I'm going to turn the event over to Congressman Peters.
Thanks, Marianne, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure and my honor to be the representative for the 52nd District in California. And I wanted to take some time today, and I will take a little time to talk about these two really historic pieces of legislation. And I want to start by giving a little overview of both bills before we dig in about what's in each of them and where they stand today. First is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, sometimes called the BIF. That's going to provide essential funding to bring our nation's hard infrastructure up to speed. So this is a plan to modernize our bridges, our roads, transit, communications network, power grid. It took about 5.5 months of serious bipartisan, bicameral talks between members of Congress and the president. It's a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package backed by Republicans in the Senate, 19 of them, plus Democrats, and it'll drive economic growth and make it easier for everyone to live and do business in the United States. The second bill, known as the Build Back Better Act or the Budget Reconciliation Bill, we'll call it the Build Back Better Act, will make larger investments in America's future. And the Senate Budget Committee originally came out with an outline that laid out sweeping funding for childcare, education, climate initiatives, healthcare, and more. Because this bill is so big, Congress still has to nail down many of the details to ensure that it can receive the support that's needed both in the House and the Senate to actually become law. Now, these transformative packages provide once-in-a-lifetime investments, and both are part of President Biden's agenda, and I support the passage of both. And I want to make that clear. I support the passage of both. Let's talk a little bit about what's in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework first. Because some people have labeled it a highway bill, and it is a highway bill, but it's really much more. It has $110 billion of new funds for roads, bridges, and major projects, $40 billion in new spending for bridge repair, replacement, and rehabilitation. This is the largest single dedicated bridge investment since the construction of the interstate highway system back in the 50s. $17.5 billion for major projects that are too large or complex for traditional funding programs, but will deliver significant economic benefits to communities. $11 billion in transportation safety programs, including walkability and bikeability. $39 billion to modernize transit, improve transit accessibility, and continuing existing transit programs for 5 years as part of the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. This is the largest federal investment in public transit in history and devotes a larger share of funds from Surface Transportation Reauthorization to transit as has ever been dedicated in the history of the program. It will repair and upgrade aging infrastructure, modernize bus and rail fleets, make stations accessible, and bring transit service to new communities. I think we can all agree that that's foundational to dealing with getting cars off the road in terms of climate action. This bill has $66 billion in rail to eliminate the Amtrak maintenance backlog, modernize the Northeast Corridor, and bring world-class rail service to areas outside the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. I want to remind you that the second busiest Amtrak corridor after the Northeast Corridor is the corridor between Los Angeles and San Diego. And I'm going to work hard to make sure that we improve that corridor. A part of this money is $22 million as grants to Amtrak, $12 billion for intercity rail service, $5 billion for rail improvements and safety grants. Again, this is the largest investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak 50 years ago. $17 billion goes to port infrastructure. As a former port commissioner, port commission chairman, I'm proud of that. $25 billion will go to airports to address repair and maintenance backlogs. $55 billion to clean drinking water, including dedicated funding to reduce lead service lines. We all saw what happened in Flint, and reduce the dangerous chemical PFAS. This represents the largest investment in clean drinking water in American history. And $65 billion to ensure that every American has access to reliable, high-speed internet, with a historic investment in broadband infrastructure deployment. I think we can all agree on how important that is to giving opportunity to everyone, no matter what your zip code. So a couple important victories for climate in the bipartisan infrastructure package. Again, I'm talking about the first one again, the bipartisan one. It expands interstate transmission to boost clean energy deployment. So there's $73 billion for thousands of miles of new resilient electric transmission lines to facilitate the expansion of renewable energy. And this is a huge win for energy reliability and climate action. The bill includes My Power On Act. To meet the nation's energy goals, we need more rapid build out of interstate transmission lines so you can take clean energy from places like where there's a lot of sun, for instance, like Arizona and New Mexico, to places where there isn't, like Detroit and Chicago. You need interstate transmission for that. My bill will make it easier to build those transmission lines while creating a more inclusive process with states, tribes, and property owners, but really doesn't let them wait around anymore to build these things, gives the federal government backstop authority to make it happen. Second, wildfires. I think everyone in San Diego knows is sensitive to wildfire dangers and how they've changed over time. And we've seen that here. And we're continuing to see a wildfire crisis play out in the American West. Firefighters routinely say that the blazes that they're battling are more dangerous, more severe, more unpredictable than they've ever seen. And the fires are both severe due to climate change, more severe due to climate change, and they're themselves contributing to the climate crisis. In 2020, California wildfires released 112 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is about 50 million metric tons more than the California power sector releases per year. Wildfires way more than power, roughly equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions of 24.2 million passenger cars driving in a single year. We have to combat these fires with the full strength of the federal government. Our communities and our first responders and the climate deserve nothing less. The bipartisan infrastructure deal includes significant funding for wildfire mitigation and resilience, including over $100 million for hazardous fuels reduction projects on public and private lands, and two bills I co-sponsored, Senator Alex Padilla's bill to provide grants to harden the electric grid against extreme weather, including wildfires, and the Wildfire Fire Mitigation and Management Commission Act of 2021 that'll help create a more comprehensive approach to addressing wildfires with the full strength of the federal government. And again, now third, other climate provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure bill promote the use of electric vehicles and help expand clean energy. I co-sponsored the Clean Commute for Kids Act to provide grants to replace existing buses with clean zero emission buses. That's a bipartisan effort, and that deal includes $7.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, and including charging stations, right? And $5 billion for a clean school bus program. The Build Back Better Act would provide even more funding. And to address the climate crisis, we must also lead the world in developing next generation clean technologies. The bipartisan infrastructure bill funds critical energy technologies and projects, including for geothermal, energy efficiency, clean hydrogen, and carbon removal technologies. All these investments are imperative to ensure our country's competitiveness in the 21st century. And we need to pass this bill. All of what I've talked about is just the first bill, just the bipartisan bill, okay? It's a lot. It would be transformative in itself. And when I was first in Congress, we never even thought about a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. we talked about $300-400 billion that we need for roads. Well, this does that and much more. So it's really important to get it passed. But I also agree with Democrats that we have to do more than that. We have that opportunity. And that's why we need the Build Back Better Act. This bill will include critical funding, more funding for climate change, and life-changing investments in America's middle-class families and children. And this is our moment to prove that to the American people that the government works for them, not just those at the top. Build Back Better, the second bill, means more jobs and lower taxes. I'm talking about the original draft now, right? It would create millions of jobs while tackling the climate crisis and ensure that America will not only compete, but lead the way to a clean energy future. Our historic investments in clean technologies will create 2 million jobs each year over the next decade, while reducing carbon emissions 50% by 2030. Meanwhile, we have transformative investments in childcare, paid leave, home-based care, and universal free pre-K. It'll set children up for a brighter future and support working parents. Historic investments in workforce training to connect workers to today's jobs, and to research and development to strengthen American manufacturing and enhance small business access to credit and investment. Democrats, and I don't want you to forget this because this was just this year, we've already made sure that 40 million American families received a tax cut through the Biden child tax credit, the Biden child tax credit, which is helping cut child poverty in half. The Build Back Better Act would double down on those investments and would result in one of the largest middle-class tax cuts ever. The idea is that no one making under $400,000 would pay a penny more in taxes. Now, that doesn't mean that the bill is free from controversy. As you know, we don't have 50 senators who will support this bill as it's written. So there's a lot of negotiations going on now among the Senate, between the Senate and the president, about where he would be, where the Senate will be, where they will land. And I've also raised an objection to one part of the Build Back Better Act, which is the drug pricing provision in something we call HR 3. And I want to set this record straight about that because I've heard some pretty wild claims about where I am on this. Now, the reason I can't support HR 3 is because it puts our ability to find future cures at risk. Now, it proposes to have government set a price, then charge a 95% excise tax against companies that refuse to accept that price. That's not negotiation, that's price setting. And there's very little incentive for an investor to put money into drug development if there's no ability to achieve a return on that investment. Remember that drug development is a partnership of the public sector and the private sector. Taxpayers invest about over $40 billion in the National Institutes of Health each year to do medical research. And you know that that's happened in San Diego, where you see the Salk Institute, Scripps Research, UCSD, Sanford Berman Prebys, La Jolla Immunology, all using that money to do basic scientific research. And it's very important. And there's no bigger advocate for the NIH in Congress than I am. There's a lot of us, but none is more ardent an advocate for NIH than me. And I think they would tell you that in Washington. But that's the public side. But we rely on the private sector to invent medicines using that research. And in 2018, the private sector invested more than $100 billion in drug development at no risk to taxpayers. Again, $40 billion on the public side, $100 billion on the private side. And that investment doesn't get made if there's no ability to earn a return at the other side. Investors who put up money for drug development have explained how HR 3 would dry up that investment and cost jobs. And in San Diego, this would be devastating. We're the third largest biotechnology cluster in America. 68,000 people are employed in life sciences directly, mostly doing research. 175,000 people, according to Biocom, rely indirectly on that industry. And this is 1,000 companies, almost 1,000 companies. So it's not just big companies like Johnson & Johnson or Eli Lilly or Pfizer, who are important employers here, but most of them are small companies really trying to find cures based on this risk capital that's invested in those companies. So it's my job to protect this pillar of our local economy. And I've often said, people who are from Michigan are for cars, people who are from Iowa are from corn, and it should be no surprise that I'm for biotechnology. But it's not just about the investment in the jobs, it's about the cures. It's really about the cures. And I got to tell you that over 50 rare disease patient advocacy groups who fight for cures like cancer, ALS, multiple sclerosis, lupus, rare autoimmune diseases have publicly expressed concern with the pricing mechanism in HR3 because they worry that the cures we might lose would be the ones that save the lives of the sick people that they fight for. The Congressional Budget Office has projected that we would lose cures over time if we enact HR3, and independent analysts have suggested the number of cures lost would be far worse than CBO predicts. And those potential cures, what could be for a rare autoimmune disease that affects only a few, or for something like Alzheimer's that not only is a budget buster for the country, but is obviously affects so many people, including my family. So, knowing I could not support this piece of the bill, I wanted to offer a solution. And some of my colleagues and I introduced the Reduced Costs and Continued Cures Act. I really object to people suggesting that I don't support lower out-of-pocket costs for seniors. That's just manifestly not true. The proposal we put out would, for the first time, limit out-of-pocket drug expenses of any senior to a maximum of $3,100 per year, $3,100 per year. For lower income seniors, $1,200 a year. That's a lower amount than HR3. That's better protection than HR3. Our bill would cap insulin expenses at $50 a month. It would allow Medicare to negotiate for better prices. It would close, ours is more narrow than the HR3 negotiation, obviously, which is a price setting, as I explained. It would also close patent loopholes abused by drug manufacturers that make it harder for patients to get generics, which are less expensive. And it pays for this by imposing a cap on price increases that drug manufacturers can impose. And we extend that retroactively to 2016, so we can claw back excess profits from the pharma companies to pay for this and to generate more savings for the healthcare system. So I object strenuously to the deceptive assertion that the reason I oppose the bill because I want drug prices to be high. That is not true. It is a falsehood. My proposal would achieve exactly the opposite. And my proposal, by the way, to lower drug prices today, just like Democrats have long proposed, would lower prices today while we preserve the ability of American science to invest the cures for tomorrow. We have to do both. Our bill would pay for itself, and we estimate generate another $200 to $400 billion to support additional healthcare coverage. We all agree that we have to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Every Democrat agrees with that, and Republicans haven't been on board with that, but certainly all of us agree with that. And the conversations I've had over the last few weeks with my colleagues in the House and Senate, as well as representatives in the White House, have been productive, and I'm optimistic that the final version of Build Back Better will fix some of my underlying concerns. So both of these bills have to pass, and I'm committed to do everything I can to make that happen. Where are they? The bipartisan infrastructure framework has already been negotiated, written, passed the Senate with 69 votes, is ready for a full vote in the House. The Build Back Better Act, on the other hand, is far from being done. And as I mentioned before, this bill is set to pass through a process called reconciliation, which is a special process that's designed to allow lawmakers to change tax and spending policy. And you can do that with 50 votes instead of the typical 60 votes that you need in the Senate because of the traditional filibuster. There are specific rules that a reconciliation bill has to follow, namely all of the provisions have to produce a change in outlays or revenues. So the lawmakers have to consult with the Senate parliamentarian to address potential challenges against the rule so they can fix or drop provisions that are needed. One thing that came up was immigration. We are committed to immigration reform in our party. We wanted to include that in Build Back Better. It looks like the parliamentarian is saying that doesn't affect outlays or revenues, so you can't do it. And so I disagree. I mean, I certainly am disappointed in that outcome, but we do have to go through this process in order to maintain the privilege of the 51 votes. Everything in the Build Back Better Act has to not only involve budget-related changes, it can include policies that have no fiscal impact or merely incidental fiscal impact. In addition to some of these changes that we have to do to be in line with reconciliation, the Build Back Better Act has to get 50 Democrats to vote for it in the Senate. And I don't know if you follow the news at all, you know that there aren't 50 senators who agree with the proposal that came out for $3.5 trillion from the Senate Budget Committee. There just aren't. I think the president told us in caucus it's going to be smaller. And a few weeks ago during the Budget Committee markup, I said we needed more time in this bill. We had 24 pages of legislative text, knowing it wouldn't pass the Senate. We only had 3 Congressional Budget Office scores for 3 committees parts of the bill about what it was going to cost. And I, as a member of the budget committee, thought it was not ready to go. And it was apparent then, and that's been playing out now in the last few weeks, that the bill's getting significant restructuring and consideration before it will be put up for a vote. So I'll keep working and negotiating in good faith with my colleagues to get these critical but challenging efforts past the finish line. I think these are going to be transformative. I don't think anyone should have expected that they would be easy or free from controversy. These were not written by Moses. They were written by legislators, and they're subject to amendment and discussion, and that's what we're doing. So, Marianne, I think that's probably enough for me now. I'd love to have questions as they come through.
We're going to go to our first question, was from Mr. Edward Chaplin, and his question is on federal funding to local police departments and police reform. He says, in 2003, hospitals were paid more for Medicare patients if they developed quality assurance and performance improvement programs instead of looking at adverse outcomes such as complaints, injuries, and deaths. Physician performance in selected disease was randomly audited, and this initiative dramatically improved physician and hospital performance on selected metrics, reduced complications, and transformed the culture of managing physician performance. Why can't police funding have the same requirements attached to audit records and body cam data in selected situations?
That's a great question and a really interesting idea. And the idea, obviously, police operations are primarily within jurisdictions of localities, counties and cities. Sometimes the federal government has leverage to use its funding to get better performance out of cities and counties. In this case, I mean, most of what we do is provide training to different departments. This is consistent, and that kind of support is consistent with what we would want to have provided with the Justice and Policing Act, which the Democrats adopted and was installed in the Senate. What I don't know is if withholding that would provide the leverage that we want. What we're really trying to do is offer as many departments good training as we can, as one way to see if we can get better performance. But let me take a look at the idea, and if you leave your information with the staff, we'll get back to you and see what ideas we might be able to have about whether a request to the Justice Department or legislation might be in order.
I just wanted to note, as I go through these questions, this is a town hall that is related to the congressional office, which means it's being provided to you with government resources. So it's considered an official town hall. And that prohibits us from answering any questions or talking about campaigns and elections. There's a few questions in here directly related to those, and I'm sorry, but we cannot take those in this forum. The next question is from Patrine McShane, and she asks, why should people in the US pay more for prescription drugs than people in other countries such as Canada and European Union states?
Well, the bottom line is I don't think we should, and that's why I proposed a bill that would reduce out-of-pocket costs for seniors. The thing I would also say is that one of the things that the Disability Council has pointed out to us that is a concern for them is that we not lower drug prices in the way that some other countries do, which is we restrict access to, they restrict access to cures. That's why the National Council on Disability has expressed opposition to the funding mechanism of HR 3. I think what we do is we don't cut into access, but we provided the same relief for consumers at the pharmacy counter as HR 3 does. And so I think we're all in agreement that Americans should not pay more for drugs than they pay in other countries. We need to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. That's what my bill would do.
Okay. The next question, same topic, from Tama Becker-Verano. Please confirm that your bill, the Reduced Costs and Continued Cures Act, would not permit negotiation in Part D, the portion of Medicare which covers the majority of drugs for 46 million beneficiaries and accounts for 6 times the spending of Part B. That's where the greatest savings can be achieved. And she's using the figures of 183 billion versus 37 billion. I'm not sure what those figures are, but I think she wants to know about the revenue that it generates.
My proposal is for Part B because some of the most in aggregate spending on Part D is higher. But that doesn't mean that those are the most expensive drugs. A lot of the most expensive drugs are in Part B, injectable drugs, and also the incentives in Part B are wrong. Part B is a fee for service mechanism, so that you get a markup from the hospital, you get a markup from the doctor. There's the incentive in that Part B is actually for providers to get higher drug costs, and that's perverse. In Part D, there's already a lot of negotiations in the market to keep those prices down. So I think the need in Part B is actually higher than in Part D. Now, having said that, there's nothing that would prevent us from doing the same kind of negotiation that I proposed in Part B in Part D. We just thought it was more critical in Part B because that's where a lot of the incentives are wrong. There's already a lot of negotiation in the market that helps keep down prices in Part D. And also I believe, and since there's a lot of people on there, I believe that most of our spending in Part D is on generics, which already have competition. But there's no reason why we could, if the administration were interested in expanding it to Part D as part of an agreement, I think we should listen to that.
Next question is from Howard Wayne. What are your priority items in the reconciliation bill?
So for me, I think climate is extremely important to me, as I think everybody knows. I don't want anyone to poo-poo the investments that the bipartisan infrastructure framework makes in public transportation and electric vehicles and clean water. I think there's a lot of environmental benefits in there. I just think we need to do more, particularly because we do invest in some of the riskier technologies. We need to do federal research on energy and innovation. There's also a clean energy standard in the Build Back Better Act that I think is important too. California is way ahead of the rest of the country in getting our power sector to reduce emissions, and the federal government needs to catch up. There's an attempt to do that through a reconciliation proof mechanism. I think that's very important. I also think it's important for us to get people on healthcare who aren't on healthcare. And so I would devote some of the savings from my bill that lowers drug prices to making subsidies available to people to get into the individual markets under the Affordable Care Act. And I guess my other priority is investing in kids. We spend a lot more money on seniors than we do on kids in this country. I think it's so cost effective to invest in things like pre-K. Even Oklahoma understands that. I don't mean to be denigrating to Oklahoma, but that's not a blue state, that's a red state. And it's also the child tax credit has been such a huge success. I think those kinds of investments in getting our kids off to the right start is not just good for people with kids, but good for the whole society, because kids who succeed are less likely to need those support services down the road that we try to save money on. And I think investing in kids would be a priority for me.
Vivian LaPaglia asks, why should Americans pay multiple times more than all nations for drug prices? We pay 3 to 4 times more for brand name drugs. Drug company innovation is not an acceptable excuse. Why should we pay more?
Well, I think I answered that before, Marion. We shouldn't pay more. That's why I propose a bill that lowers drug prices for seniors more than HR 3 for the neediest seniors. So I think we're on board with that.
We have a question from Elizabeth Savage. She says she is the executive director of the Lupus Foundation of Southern California, an advocate for lupus patients. She knows many patients that she works with that have chronic disease. She wants to thank you for working to find an alternative solution to high drug costs. Her question is, why does the Reduced Costs and Continued Cures Act, what does the Reduced Costs and Continued Cures Act do to protect chronic disease patients from facing high costs of drugs and medical care?
Well, again, we're working with Medicare, so that deals with seniors. We're talking about Medicare negotiating prices, for instance. The idea is that no one should have to choose between paying the mortgage or the rent and paying for their prescription drugs. We passed HR 3, I think, twice before, sent it off to the Senate where it died, and there's not votes to pass that in the Senate today. So I've got a bill that to make sure that that nobody pays more than $3,100 a year for their prescription drugs. But if you're the neediest senior, depending on your income level, it could be $1,800 or $1,200. And so that's the protection that's going to help you sleep at night. That even if you get a serious disease, something like lupus, you'll be able to afford your medicines. And the other thing is, I think that you appreciate this at the Lupus Foundation. You're one of the advocates for these difficult diseases. We want American science to be developing the next cures here on American shores. We saw American science move from Europe. We saw science move from Europe and innovation move from Europe to the United States when Europe did something much like that we're considering doing in HR 3. I don't want those technologies to go to India, to China, or to Israel. We've got a great thing going here in the United States. Like I said, not just big companies, although I'm thankful to Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson for the contribution that they made in a public-private partnership to deal with COVID. I'm really happy about that. But a lot of smaller companies, like I said, almost 1,000 companies in San Diego County trying to work on these cures. And I think that's one of the best things we can do for patients with difficult diseases is make sure that we continue to develop those cures. And I'm happy that it happens here in San Diego for our economy, but I really want it to happen in the United States of America. And that's what I intend to preserve.
The next question is from Bob Treitler. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He asked, how is it that Postmaster DeJoy is still on his mission to destroy the post office? Is there any movement to get him out?
Bob, I appreciate your question. I share the concern. I know there's been a lot of ridiculous delays in mail, and particularly as we approach a election in Virginia, that kind of stuff really worries me. All the talk around the elections and Bob DeJoy before, I think, fortunately, we survived, and I'm thankful to the Postal Service for getting the mail through. But the Postmaster General does not serve at the pleasure of the president. There's a bipartisan 9-member board of governors who can modify the term, but right now, Mr. DeJoy is supported by that board. We think that within the next few months, the appointments will change, and once the appointments change, and President Biden has appointed them, I think that it's reasonable to expect that Mr. DeJoy will be asked to move along, and I hope that happens. I think people rely on the USPS for medication, paychecks, many important items, and so I share your concern and hope that it's resolved favorably. By the way, we do handle USPS casework in my office, so if you have particular issues, folks should be you're all invited to call the district office and see if we can't help out. But thank you for that question. It's a good one.
Next question is from Bo Reed. He says, first of all, thank you for being a consistent voice of reason and common sense in such a highly politicized environment. His question, Senator Manchin's concern about the size of the Build Back Better plan seemed to be primarily related to the anticipated impact on the country's debt and/or deficit, while the administration seems to be indicating that it will be fully paid for without adding to the debt. Can you please explain this apparent discrepancy in perspectives about the impact on U.S. debt? Thanks, from Bo Reed.
Sure, Bo. I don't know Senator Manchin that well. I see him from time to time. But my understanding, obviously there's a debt and there's a deficit. So deficit is the amount we add to debt is the total amount the country owes. Deficit is the amount we add year to year. And my understanding is that President Biden's pledge is not to add to the annual deficits, but there won't be extra money through the tax increases to pay down the debt. And my understanding is that Senator Manchin would like to devote some of the money that we raise through tax increases to paying down the debt as well as not increasing the deficit. So I think that's it. I would say this. I think the first question, if you take the premise that accept the premise that it will be paid for, which I think is honorable, and I commend the president and the speaker for saying it's going to be paid for. You have to know how much money you have at the beginning. So, the president proposed, I think, $3.5 trillion in revenues. The House Ways and Means Committee proposed 2.6. We hear Joe Manchin is for 1.5. I mean, if it was 1.5, it would still be a historic opportunity to invest, but we can't allocate the money until we know how much it is. So one of the things we're asking is have the Senate tell us how much money we have. And the one flexibility I would tell you about that, because I am concerned about the budget, is that the climate provisions are not as strictly subject to the pay for restrictions as other expenditures, because the Congressional Budget Office, who does the scoring of the budget, doesn't account for the cost of doing nothing on climate. So the Democratic caucus has basically said, well, we're paying for everything as we go, except COVID, which is an emergency, and except for climate provisions where we'll be more flexible. So I think there's some flexibility, even though 1.5 number above that, if you were willing to borrow some for climate, which I think we think is probably appropriate in some instances. But that's Manchin's concern. He wants to make sure that not only do we not add to the deficit, but we actually start to pay down the debt a little bit as well.
Next is a question and comment from Diana Todaro. She says, when will you stop using, quote, climate change as an excuse for arson and mismanagement? These, quote, investments are a massive money grab. Where are the details to show the, quote, pork and waste? She's disgusted with this administration.
One of the things I've expressed is that I'm, if we do a $1.2 trillion, a $3.5 trillion, whatever it is, bill, I mean, we ought to be very careful about how we allocate the money, because there's a lot of opportunity for fraud. One of the things we saw, I was very supportive of pandemic relief earlier in the year. We saw that there was some fraud in the provisions for unemployment insurance. We had to get that money out. I think we accepted that we were in an emergency. Here we have time. We should make sure that we button up those loopholes and that we don't see that kind of thing. One thing I would say, though, about fraud is I think the most widely accepted new revenue that we'll see is an effort to help the IRS crack down on tax cheats. When you and I pay taxes, we pay the whole amount that we owe. We know that a lot of people aren't paying those taxes, and there's hundreds of billions of dollars left out on the table without raising rates. So I'd like to crack down on that fraud. I support dealing with that. And I certainly think that any expenditure of federal funds should be closely monitored, and that we should make sure that there's accountability. As for particular climate provisions, I do think we should be investing in the most effective ones. I think one of the things that I've been interested in is a price on carbon that would be fully refunded to taxpayers, to make sure that the private sector is making choices along the way that are good for the climate. And I think that may be part of the bill. I'm not sure yet. It's not yet, but I think we should be looking for efficiency. We should be cracking down on fraud, and certainly agree with you on those points.
This question is from Adam Cooper. Will you commit to fighting to maintain and fully funding the Civilian Climate Corps in the reconciliation bill to make millions of good jobs for young people to fight the climate crisis?
Yes.
Okay. Next question is from Lori Fisher. Assuming we want the U.S. to be a leader on climate issues, what can Congress do to send a positive message when President Biden goes to Scotland for climate talks at the end of October? Don't we need to pass climate legislation that includes a fee on carbon with dividends to citizens, an agreement to work on carbon border adjustment mechanisms to facilitate trade and keep our economy competitive?
Yes, we do. I actually think, as you probably know, I've been working with Senator Coons on both of those issues. I'll be accompanying him to Europe and to Scotland to talk about these things. I went to COP25 with a speaker in Madrid. While we were not sending, under President Trump, we weren't sending any representatives, and we just showing up, I think, was important. This time, I think we want to show up, and we want to make sure that we're accounting for our impacts as a economy. We're still the largest economy, but only about 10% of emissions. But we need to be a leader. We need to be engaged. So I think one thing is we should show up, but I also think we have to, we can't be throwing stones if we're in a glass house, and we have to take care of our own business. You mentioned two things. One is a carbon price that's fully refundable to taxpayers. I think that makes a lot of sense. The Citizens Climate Lobby has been engaged in working on that. And I think it's more effective in many ways than regulation. If you want to know the difference between regulation and price incentives, which is more effective, I invite you to look at the war on drugs. We have some pretty tough regulations on drugs, but supply and demand still rules the day. And I think that a carbon price would really affect everyone's decision-making on climate, from the smallest business, the household, up to the largest company. I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's also important in terms of trade, because if you think that Europe is imposing a $70 a ton price on carbon, I think that's in line with what England's going to do, or the United Kingdom. Canada is talking about well over $100. They're not going to trade with us if we're not bearing our own costs. And likewise, the companies that are doing the right thing in the United States don't deserve to compete against people who are doing the wrong thing in other parts of the world. So that border carbon adjustment will kind of level the playing field. We want to talk about that when we go to Scotland with the rest of the world. I think that's going to be important.
I was scrolling through the other questions, Scott. Did you mention that you are also going to COP?
I just did. That's it. We're going to. I'm going with Senator Coon's group in mid-November, I think.
Next question is from Rachel Tate. Rachel says the CBO concluded that HR 3 will save Medicare at least $450 billion over a decade. How did you conclude that your bill, the Reduced Costs and Continued Cures Act, will save $200 billion? And will you share how the savings were calculated, including who calculated the savings? Got tongue-tied there. Sorry about that.
Right. We relied on the Ways and Means Committee information and the Congressional Budget Office, which, by the way, has provided new estimates on HR 3. We think that HR 3, without any price negotiation, if you took the price negotiation out of HR 3, just relied on the rebates, the inflation caps, that itself is worth $350 billion. One of the reasons our bill doesn't return as much is we provide more relief at the counter, at the pharmacy counter, than HR 3. So it costs more to provide that relief to patients. But we could roll our relief to patients back to the level of HR 3, and our bill would essentially be would generate $350 billion, which is the number we got off of the previous work on HR 3, without negotiation. If you added in our negotiation, it would start to approach $400 billion. So that's a substantial amount of money to save the federal government, a substantial amount of money we can invest in other healthcare priorities, whether it's getting more people on the Affordable Care Act exchange, which I favor, whether it's expanding Medicaid, access to Medicaid in states that haven't expanded it. I think it's a pretty good proposal that way. Now, it doesn't disincentivize the investment of risk capital, which is a price I don't think we should pay. And I think, like I said, my alternative gives a pretty good return to the federal government without jeopardizing that risk capital. And I think we should do it.
Next question is from Barry Bernstein, who is president of the University City Community Association. He said, "Thank you, Congressman Peters, for the information and explanation of these complicated issues and for your personal efforts to reduce prescription drug costs." He'd like to ask about how the federal government, state of California, the county, and the city of San Diego tackle the issue of the Tijuana River Channel to really do something in a more serious way to clean the pollution that affects our oceans and our residents.
Well, this is a real priority for me and the entire delegation. And so, it's most of the area that's worst affected is represented by Juan Vargas in the South Bay, Imperial Beach. But I represent Coronado, which also has a big effect. And And I think the whole delegation has been really active in trying to get money. So when we first were in Congress, and Marianne, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was a border fund, border water infrastructure fund that had once been funded at $100 million, but had atrophied down, and I think we had $3 or $5 million a year in it. We were starting to work on appropriations, and we're trying to we got $15 million one year, we got $30 million. We thought we were doing really well, but the kind of money you needed was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So when we did the United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement, we said, why would we do a deal with Mexico without fixing this problem? So we were able to get, I give the speaker a lot of credit, and the Senator Feinstein and all the delegation, $300 million set aside to deal with cross-border pollution. So that was a good start. We've been working now with the consulate in Mexico. If you did this as an engineering project, you'd ask what they're going to do with their infrastructure. We want to make sure that they fix the outfall. Their sewage plant is one of the bigger problems because it just can't handle the sewage from Tijuana, as well as the flow from the river and the flows from the canyons. And I would say we've got a really good relationship with Mexico and trying to work on this. And we got to work with EPA Region 9. So we're trying to find ways to do those long-term big projects that will solve the problem with an understanding that we have to do something now, that this is unacceptable. And the level of flows since 2017 has increased so that where you once had dozens or even 100 days of closed beaches, now beaches are closed every day, whether it's raining, which used to be the problem, or not. And so we've got really good cooperation from this administration. We had Administrator Regan out from the EPA. We took him out there, and actually it was wonderful. It was a really smelly day. There had just been a spill. He got to experience the whole experience that people in the South Bay get to experience. And I think he was really taken by it. He really wants to work on it. So with the administration, with the funds we have, with this delegation, both in the Senate and the House, I'm optimistic that we can make some good progress. But check in with us, and if Barry, I know we talk to you all the time about a number of issues around University City, but keep in touch with us about giving you an update on that, so that we can make sure that you're up to date and we're keeping on track.
A couple of things I just wanted to comment. There are comments in the question and in the Q&A, and there are comments and questions in the chat. So I'm doing my best to go back and forth. So if it doesn't look like I'm going in order, I'm trying to go through and maybe skip over questions that have already been asked and answered. And I'm also trying to focus mostly on people that are online that are from the district. Next question is from Tom Lavorne. He's asking, why did you vote no on an amendment that would be a huge invasion of Americans' privacy by requiring financial institutions to report gross inflows or outflow of $600 or more from Americans' financial accounts to the IRS?
I'm aware of the issue. Tom, I have to confess, I don't remember that amendment. I'm not on the Ways and Means Committee. I'm in the Energy and Commerce Committee. So I wouldn't have voted on that at committee, but I'll just give you my sense of the issue, which is tax compliance. We are seeing a lot of people, looks like not paying their taxes. And one of the things we need to do is have banks tell us where money's flowing. And I appreciate that people think that, I think now you have to disclose whether you move $10,000 or more, that gets disclosed. I think that there has to be some reasonable reporting, some ability for the IRS to understand what money is moving. I don't know whether $600 is the right level or not, but I'm supportive of increasing funding for the IRS so that I don't get cheated. I pay all my taxes. I want to make sure that everyone else pays their taxes. And we could talk more about what the level of reporting is, but it does seem to me that there needs to be more transparency for the federal government into what's going on in the movement of money. But that particular amendment, I'd be happy to get back to you about. I just don't remember a vote on that.
Next question is from Dave Braggs. He asks, where do we stand on the Voting Rights Act? What protections does California plan to implement to strengthen voting laws and also put pressure on states that are eroding their voting laws? For example, California, restricting California government travel to those states. I think that's more of a state of California question, but you want to talk about the Voting Rights Act?
Well, let's talk about California is a model. It's so easy to vote in California. You can drop off your ballot at any place. You can mail it. You can go in person. If you forgot whether you mailed it, you can mail another one, a provisional one. You have a month to vote. And I think you can vote so that it's postmarked by the date. That's why people say, as a candidate, I was often frustrated that it would take weeks. It would take a week to count the votes. But that's because we want to provide the ability for everyone to vote. In democracy, we should want more people to vote, not fewer people to vote. And so I'm a big supporter of what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that would expand opportunities around the country for people to vote. I think it only makes sense. Where is that? It is in the Senate. This is one of those things that's not related to the revenues or outlays. Can't be done in reconciliation. It needs 60 votes. I know Joe Manchin has proposed a slimmed down version of the bill. Stacey Abrams, who's you may not know, is a major voting rights activist in Georgia, a very important voice, has blessed it. I think we should vote. The Senate should vote on it. I think the House would certainly vote on anything that's amended and come back to us, but it is sitting in the Senate. And I think, I actually think that I'm not a fan of the filibuster, but as long as the filibuster is around, I think it's going to be difficult to pass that. I hope they would consider amending the filibuster in some way to allow democracy to work, and I'd be supportive of that.
The next question is from, sorry, there's two Campbells here and I lost the second Campbell. Questions from Michael Campbell. What funding is in the packages for increasing housing stock, particularly near transit sources?
As you know, the funding for housing and jurisdiction over housing has traditionally been mostly local. The state has provided a lot of assistance. The federal government provides support for affordable, they provide a low-income tax credit to provide support for the deals that can't be done by the market, to provide rent-restricted properties that people can afford who don't make a ton of money, and sort of legitimately restricted affordable housing. We do some of that. We do veterans vouchers for supportive housing, which we fought for. And the bill is supportive of that. Also money for the Housing Trust Fund, which helps build housing for the lowest income Americans. And a new stream of funding to provide for affordable housing supply by paying attention to economic opportunities and proximity to public transportation. This is something I really believe in. I think Michael, as you know, I proposed something called the Build More Housing Near Transit Act. When I was a member of the city council in the last decade, in 2004, our voters agreed by a 2/3 vote to extend the half-cent sales tax for transportation. A large part of that investment would be the Mid-Coast trolley extension from Old Town up to UCSD and the UTC. And I thought it was great. We worked to get matching grants for that. That was worth $1 billion of the taxpayers' investment. We got another $1 billion from the federal government, Federal Transit Authority. But what I realized as a federal elected official is that no one ever asked me what I was going to do around those stops on the trolley to make sure that people would use it. And in fact, it turns out we have a lot of parking lots near there, not housing that people could walk to transit from. So I proposed a bill that would make part of the competition for federal funds an explanation by the local governments of what they're going to be putting next to those transit facilities. And I think housing is a logical investment for California and for San Diego. I think that we're getting closer and closer to having this notion included, that we should ask local governments to step up and do land uses that are complementary, that would draw more riders, because riders mean more fare box recovery. That's going to help if you're concerned about taxpayers and taxpayer investment, but also more cars off the road. And so we're excited about the attitude of particularly this Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg. He's really connected how transportation policy is climate policy in a way that I haven't seen before. And we want to support him.
Michael Snare asks, what do you propose to do to deal with things like price gouging on insulin?
Well, right. I mean, our bill would make sure you don't pay more than $50 a month for insulin. I mean, it's one of the most heartbreaking and outrageous things I hear is people who can't afford insulin, who are metering their doses or going without. I mean, that's not right for these life-saving drugs. It was similar to the abuse of the EpiPen. Things that people need shouldn't be jacked up. And our bill would both limit the price increases on those things, but also with insulin in particular, impose a $50 a month cap. So no one really has to go without. And I really hope it gets passed because previous attempts to do something about drug prices have gone nowhere. We got to work together to get something passed. And my bill would really protect insulin or people who rely on insulin.
The next question is from Margaret Spiegelman. Could you talk about where things stand on including the FAIR Act or another polluter import fee in the budget, or about any possible changes to the FAIR Act? Could a polluter import fee be coupled with a price on carbon?
Right. Again, I think the price on carbon is probably one of the most important measures that we can take. And I think economists agree with this. By the way, California has both a clean energy standard, but also has a cap and trade, it puts a price on carbon to incentivize everybody through pricing to move away from fossil fuels. And I think we have to remember too that, we want to make the polluter pay. The polluter is you and me. We're the people driving our cars around town. We ought to be incentivized to drive a better car, to walk, to bike, to share rides, to ride public transit. Price is what drives those behaviors. Now, I also understand that I don't want people to pay higher costs for, to bear a burden, particularly in the middle class. So that's why we proposed basically all of the money that we would receive, we would refund to anyone making less than $400,000 a year. That would make sense in the context of this Build Back Better Act. It would really help drive us to our numbers. I don't think that without a price on carbon, we get to our numbers fast enough. I don't know that we'll ever get there at all without a price on carbon. California's led the way on that. The rest of the Western world has seen it. I think we should do it. And again, it's also part of fairness. So we know that other countries are imposing these prices. They're going to ask us to pay a tariff if we don't impose the prices. So Senator Coons and I have proposed a border adjustment that would provide advantages to the companies in the United States that do the right thing, but would also make sure that we're not at a disadvantage when we trade with countries that aren't doing the right thing. And I'm a free trader. I'm not a big believer in tariffs. I supported President Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership. I still think that that's a really important part of supporting American business and American security. But I recognize that that we have to be for fair trade too, and adjustments like the border adjustment are one way to make sure that trade from country to country is fair as we all figure out what we're going to do about meeting our Paris obligations.
Next question is from Roman Diaz. He says, there's a national initiative to improve policing by responding to disturbance calls by using behavioral health experts. There are 347 countries nationally that have committed to stepping up a program that does this type of police response. Are there increases to support counties to implement these initiatives? This investment could result in better policing outcomes.
I think that's a great question. I haven't heard of the Stepping Up program before, but I'm supportive of deploying police resources in a way that is best suited to the situation. I think there's a lot of interest in having behavioral and mental health specialists respond to a lot of these things rather than police officers. This happens too in the Border Patrol, where we've asked the Border Patrol to respond to all these immigration processing. A social worker would be better off doing that kind of thing. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I want to say being a police officer is a really hard job and a dangerous job. And sometimes these situations we send people into can get violent. I just want to make sure that we are deploying the right resources. And I think that we should have a really good conversation about whether mental and behavioral health specialists are the right people to respond. I think maybe in many cases that's true. A lot of what the federal government does for the Department of Justice is provide support and training for these kinds of things. Let me check, and I guess, Roman, we can get back to you about whether this kind of support is in any of these bills. I'd like to know that myself now, and as I find out the answer, we'll be happy to get back to you. And Marianne, is there a way to get back in touch with people that you'd suggest?
Yes, in fact, the best thing, actually, Daniela, can you send me in my chat the best way for people to get in touch? I don't have the office email address in front of me. Sorry, I'm forgetting it.
Right,
Sure.
Right.
Question from Mary Agnew, I believe it's pronounced. She says, I understand the need for funding research. I assume she's talking about pharmaceuticals again. The need for funding research, but is there a way to get big pharma to set reasonable prices for the public? Right now I pay, I'm sorry, the sentence got cut off, but her question is there a way to get big pharma to set reasonable prices?
Well, again, I share your concern, and I've taken an approach like HR 3 to provide support and relief for seniors at the counter. I should also mention, by the way, that there's a restriction on what we can do in the commercial markets because of reconciliation. It looks like because what happens in the commercial markets doesn't affect federal outlays or revenues like Medicare. Medicare is a federal program, as you know. We have less ability to do a regulation of the markets through regulation, and so we want to encourage competition. One of the things my bill does, by the way, in addition to providing counter relief for seniors like HR 3, I think in a more aggressive way than HR 3, but we also stop a lot of the gaming that pharma plays at the end of patent life. So as a drug goes off patent, obviously it's open for generics. Sometimes they try to extend those patent lives, they proverbially changing the color of the pill and claiming it's a new product. We put a lot of stop to that so that you get your exclusivity period, you get your patent period, but then it's subject to competition and generics. And if there's no competition, that we would let the government negotiate for prices. So again, the important thing is when you go to the pharmacy counter, if you're a senior, you don't pay more than $3,100 a year for your drugs. Did I answer that question, Marianne?
I think you did.
Okay.
The next question is from Michael Smith. What are the prospects for incorporating carbon pricing in the Build Back Better bill?
Well, again, I don't know. I've raised this issue. This has been a little bit of a crusade of mine for a while. As I said, I don't think we get to our numbers fast enough, and maybe not at all, without some sort of carbon pricing. I think the president's concerned about people who make under $400,000 not paying any more taxes. So the way to deal with that is to rebate all the money to those people so that you get a check to cover your whatever additional energy costs you have, and you're no more out of pocket than you would have been without the energy cost. But you still have that incentive when you go to the gas pump or the car dealership to think about how much money you're spending. So I know that there have been conversations. I'm part of a group of some senators and a couple of House members about whether we can inject that kind of conversation into this, because it's quintessentially an outlay revenue thing, right? It definitely fits within reconciliation, unlike some of the other regulatory ideas that people have. So I would say it's, Build Back Better is really unformed. And I think there's a lot of open questions about what will end up there and at what level. But I would say I'm encouraged that those conversations are finally happening in earnest. And I hope that we get a resolution by the end of October, because that's when the next transportation funding runs out. And we'll want to take a vote on the bipartisan infrastructure framework. I think people will want to take a vote at the same time on at least a framework for Build Back Better. So I'm hoping that carbon pricing will be part of it.
Sorry, I know, I just realized that. I think we answered this question generally before, but it's come up a few times. This question is from Vincent Cassiano, and he says, if Congress does not enact legislation to preempt states from allowing state elected representatives from, in essence, disenfranchising the votes of their own citizens and making it more difficult for people to register and vote, our democracy will shatter. This is, to me, the most pressing issue facing our nation. Will you please address what you're going to do to preserve our democracy?
I'm not allowed to talk about elections on this phone call, but I would just say elections are important, and winning elections is important. Is that okay? I also say I was in the gallery on January 6th when the Capitol was stormed, and we were in fear for our lives in what would be one of the most targeted terrorist targets in the world, and I was just amazed that had happened. But I'd say the saddest thing that has happened in Congress, and the thing that concerns me most about the country, is that the reaction of the Republicans, who at first demanded a bipartisan commission and then totally backed away from it for totally political reasons. And I believe so much in the greatness of this country, and I think that's been a really difficult thing to comprehend, is that people would want to know about this act of their domestic terrorism. So I share the concern, and I think that taking action in the Senate is really important. I support the idea of at least an exception to the filibuster for this, so that we can get it passed. Because I do think that the biggest problem in the country right now is not any particular policy issue. We deal with policy issues all the time. That's what we do. We're a legislature. We're a government. But the division in the country, and the fact that we've decided that each other is the enemy, and I think that's a real danger. I also am concerned about political violence, and we saw threats to the speaker on January 6th, but I saw people harassing a senator in the bathroom, that kind of stuff. We need to be more caring about each other and understand that differences in policy aren't there's no treason in that. That's real patriotism, working on to solve problems together and doing it together. So I think that our best shot is to try to get something passed in the Senate, but we also have to work voter to voter in the other process to make sure that people understand the importance of this, because there's a big threat on that side as well.
Right, we are at 5:08 right now. I think that we can take a couple more questions and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah.
Scott, this question's on a different topic, and I think it's important because I know a lot of people call the office about this. This question is from Ken Pichel. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Ken. Recently, there's been considerable discussion regarding difficulties with the supply chain. How do these problems impact budget plans? I'm not sure if he's talking about the federal budget or other, but that is his questions. It's regarding the supply chain.
Yeah. So a couple things on the supply chain. First of all, the Build Back Better Act includes $10 billion to map and monitor supply chain resiliency and technological advances. I'm supportive of those provisions. I think those provisions are bipartisan. The Senate passed the U.S. Competition and Innovation Act a few months ago, which tries to shore up the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are in a lot of products today. I think most people have noticed this most acutely with car shortages. It's raised the price of buying new cars, used cars, and renting cars because it's scarce. And we've let that production go overseas. In my committee, we're also talking a lot about supply chain around healthcare. So when the pandemic hit, we didn't have masks on shore. We didn't have ventilators. We didn't have the anesthetic. We didn't make the anesthetic that use to intubate somebody for a ventilator. We didn't have the basic pharma, not the complicated pharma that I've been talking about, not the high-tech innovation pharma, but the basic drugs, saline solution, everything else. It's all gone out of control. So what I think we've suggested is we do an analysis of what do we need to have on shore that we can store, masks and things like that you can have in a warehouse generally. What do we need to make sure we make on shore? And then also we have to evaluate as we transition, what's the priority? What are the things that we're relying on non-friendly countries to produce? So, I'm a lot more comfortable having to get parts from Switzerland than maybe from China. And then we also talked about critical minerals, the kinds of things that go into batteries and other technologies that we rely on too. So our committee is taking a look at what to do about supply chain resiliency, to think about what has to be reshored, what has to be stored here, and to come up with a comprehensive plan on how to make sure that we're secure. But I think probably at the top of the list is basic pharma and semiconductors. You may have seen the 60 Minutes that dealt with Intel and how Intel had kind of fallen behind as a company. It's not normal for a government our government to step in and help a company. We do it on occasions. We did it with the auto industry, I think, to good effect. We need to make sure that semiconductors are available to Americans. I think we're relying a lot on Taiwan, but some of those things have to be done on shore. So I agree with the concern.
Last question from Patrine McShane. What about corporations that cause pollution? What about corporations being responsible for plastic waste and emissions, as well as other types of pollution by corporations and businesses? I think he's asking about how to either penalize them or hold them accountable for polluting.
Well, so I was a environmental lawyer before I went into politics, and there are many mechanisms to hold companies and any actors liable. The Clean Water Act, any discharge without a permit, the Clean Air Act, the Superfund, CERCLA, that law. The government has a lot of ways at its disposal to make sure that if you're causing pollution, that we can stop it and we can make you pay for it. Right now, I think the next sort of big pollutant is the PFAS. It's a result of fire retardants. It's all over the place. We're going to try to get people to clean it up. But the idea of the polluter paying is, since the 1970s, is really ingrained in environmental law, and I think is pretty available. The other thing is, we don't even wait for the government to enforce it. We provide the ability for private people to take up actions against offending companies or actors and recover attorney's fees from them. So, American environmental law is a pretty good model, and I think we pretty effectively deal with that. If you have a specific instance that you think is not being dealt with, you should certainly let us know. But I think a lot of avenues to make sure that corporations and any business and any actor are doing the right thing.
Would you like to make any closing remarks?
Well, I do. I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming this evening. I hope this has been informative. I'd say a couple things is that you can sign up for our newsletter, where we give you sort of weekly updates on what we're working on if you're interested. And Marianne, you can tell me how to do that. I don't have that in front of me. We're at scottpeters.house.gov. You follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at Rep Scott Peters. And if we can help you with constituent services, Medicare, Social Security, veterans benefits, even passports, please try to remember to renew your passports. If people are traveling again, it's kind of comical, but we can't always help you if you don't get your passport. 858-455-5550. And if you have other questions that we haven't answered, please feel free to send us an email and we'll get back to you.
You can
Is that fair,
email us.
Mary?
Yeah, I was just going to give the email address. You can email the office at scott.peters@mail.house.gov. I know a lot of you know how to reach out to us already, but email is the best way so we can make sure that we can keep track of it. We appreciate you joining us. I know we weren't able to get to every question. I did try to go through and make sure that we got to questions that hadn't been asked before, but we are able to record all of your comments. We appreciate everybody participating. I think at one point we had about over 300 people watching tonight, so this afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Marianne. Bye-bye.